Welcome to Between Two Clinicians, the podcast that gives you a backstage pass into the mind of two therapists. I'm Talia.
I'm Adam Luke. We've spent years helping others navigate the complexities of their minds and relationships.
In this podcast, we're flipping the script, and we're sharing our own unfiltered insights. No topic is off limits, and no issue too taboo. We're ready to tackle the tough stuff with honesty and empathy. Let's dive in.
Well, we're back to have one more good conversation.
Oh, that's the goal. The goal, and for today, you had posted, I was scrolling, as one does. I was scrolling and I saw your post, which is encapsulated by the title, Entitlement in a Relationship. But you wrote, even just what you wrote was like, this has to be a topic. Like I was like, podcast episode. You wrote about bids for connection versus demands for connection. And so I thought, start by describing and enlightening listeners who don't know what bids for connection are, and then let that be the jump off point for how that is separate from a demand, or even a request. I think like a bid and then a request and then a demand is kind of like the hierarchy of it if you're working your way up. So if we're looking at a bid for connection, this is what the Gottmans made very popular, and the example that they give is, if you're reading the paper, which nobody really ever does anymore, I think, but like if you're reading the paper and you look at, oh, that's interesting, and your partner has just walked in the room or they walk by, that's, whether we realize it or not, is a bid for connection. You want your partner to go, oh, what's interesting, and engage with you in a conversation. And then the options of response to a bid are to turn toward. So the partner in that example would be like, oh, what's interesting? So that puts money in your emotional bank account in a relationship. The other option is to turn away. So you didn't hear it. Maybe you had AirPods in when you were walking and you didn't hear it. And your partner's like, that's interesting. And you're like, oh, sorry. And you save the bid, and it puts maybe not as much, but still money in the account because you weren't intending harshly to turn away. It was just a missed bid. Like you had stuff going on. And then the worst one for the relationship is turning against, which is where you hear it. Your partner maybe invites you to the bid again. And you're like, no, I heard you. And you walk out. And that takes a lot of money out of your emotional bank account and is often coupled with the four horsemen that they talk about, namely the contempt and the criticism of, why would I lean in and, accept your bid, or why would I give you the time of day? You don't give it to me, is sometimes the reason why at least couples I work with don't want to acknowledge, like some don't know how to acknowledge a bid or look for it. That's separate from, I see it and I'm not going to acknowledge it, or now I'm making like a more verbal request where it's obvious, like, hey, I read this thing in the paper, I want to talk to you about it, versus a demand. So I'll let you take it from here. But that I felt was like relevant to have as like a foundation.
Yeah, no, that's, you nailed it with all the definitions. The post that I did was really based off of, again, themes that are coming out of my work with a lot of the men I'm working with, where they're experiencing a lot of challenges in the very personal relationships they have with their significant others. And a lot of times men get stuck in, it's sort of like caveman mode. And what I mean by that is like the joke in the caveman world was like, how did you find a wife? You drug one home. So like there's like,
yep, back then.
We use that same mentality in the relationships that we have. So when I'm making a bid for connection, maybe it's, I get home, I see my wife, I really love how she looks, I give her a kiss on the cheek, I walk away, right? I'm making a bid. Another one is I'm going to walk in, I see her in those juicy yoga pants, and I'm like, you're so hot, I want to have sex with you right now, right? And a lot of times women are like a little caught off guard in that moment, right? And then what happens is that triggers like a rejection shame response in the male partner. And then what does a male partner do? She's always a bitch, she's a prude, she never puts out, she like goes down a very negative thought train very quickly, when in reality I wasn't actually making a bid for connection. I was saying, hey, I'd love to have sex for me, but I don't necessarily want to have an experience where emotionally we're connecting, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting about this position is both of us are now experienced as a partner in a way we've never wanted to be experienced.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the couple state of mind that we learn about in psychoanalytic therapy can help couples who are
Okay.
finding more in the demand category versus the
Mm,
bid
mm,
category, because bid implies agency and choice, and demand is more so like compliance or follow through is what I'm looking for. Like, I just want you to say you're like being complicit or being compliant. And I think for when couples are able to stay in a couple state of mind, it's the honoring and the acknowledgement of like, wow, she does look really sexy in those yoga pants, and holding that internally and going, would this be like, even just asking, would this be the time? And if the time is right, how could I say it? How can I speak so that you can hear me? Right? That's kind of the book, but also that's the concept of, if I'm wanting sex, there's nothing wrong with wanting sex and inviting your partner into that, but it's the kind of the demand of it, or the like caveman, like you woman, me man. It's just that's not the turn on. Like, despite what rom-com books or whatever the romantic novels have stated, that's usually when you don't know the person and there's a lot of projections. That's the last thing we want to deal with when we're like messy, about to do a bath time, we've had a rough day or whatever else, and let's say we've shared with our partner the time of day that we are the most likely to want to be intimate, and usually nighttime is not the time for women because we're at the end of the day, it's been a long thing, we're going through the next day, and that's just the last, really sometimes the last thing on our mind. And then you come in and give us a compliment, and it's like, are you stupid? Like, are you so deaf that you thought this was the time to do it? And that's not the time to make the bid. The time to make the bid could be like, I really miss connecting with you. You know,
mm.
you look beautiful tonight. I'd love to be intimate with, like, it's learning how to speak in your partner's language so it doesn't come off as a demand or as it being an entitlement, which is what like the theme of your post was, like the entitlement
Yeah.
in a relation.
Well, and so the other aspect of it is, if I'm primarily communicating to my significant other through demands, that's already injecting this whole feeling of I don't trust you. Because when I'm making that demand for that physical affection or the physical intimacy, what I'm really communicating is I don't think you would come here without you being coerced, right? And so again, what is like the next thing that makes a person even less likely to have sex is when it feels like it's under duress. And now, something I want to be careful on here is I don't think that this begins out as a malicious thing. I think I think that whether it's a baby comes into the relationship, work schedules, all sorts of things, um, but we can correct that pretty easily
Yeah.
by speaking about what discomforts we're feeling, whether you're the spouse that you feel the demand that's being shifted on you, or trying to actually have a conversation on, well, hey, tonight is not a good night, right now is not a good time, but trust me that I'm going to follow up with you in 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever
Yes.
that. But what happens more often than not, and I can understand because I work with a lot of stay-at-home moms as well, so I hear their experiences in this as well.
Yeah.
Like, they decide to put their husband through a crucible. They're like, okay, well, we'll just dry up around here and we'll see how long you can last. And that only reinforces to the husband that I'm elective, uh, not pursued, I'm not cherished, my needs aren't going to be fulfilled unless I demand them. And we're really now stuck in this, like, I call it emotional or relational chicken, right? Which one's going to move first?
Yep.
And rarely are you going to have it where either one of you is going to move in a direction that's going to be objectively positive for both of you.
Or bonding. Yeah, I think the moving. So in the bids for connection, there's turning towards, and in the movement in relationships, there's moving towards the other partner in a way that they can receive it. And like you said, maybe not right then, but they're like, oh, they're really leaning in. They're speaking my language, trying to meet me where they know I like to be met, not where the partner likes to be met. The one who's speaking, not that person. It's the one that there is receiving the speaking. And if you can meet me there or show me that, I'm much more likely to want to lean in and pursue, and like you said, not withhold. That's when women feel that we are not
Mm,
loved or attended to, our normal our go-to is withholding, whether that's food, whether that's sex, whether that's affection, whether that's communication. It's derived from the drive to punish and criticize, which woman to woman works very well. I've given this example a lot in podcasts. The scene in Mean Girls, the like backhanded compliment scene in Mean Girls, where Regina George is like, "Oh my god, that's such a cute skirt! Like, where'd you get it?" She's like, "Oh, thanks, it's vintage." And then the girl walks away and is like, "That's the ugliest skirt I've ever seen." But there's many times where women are that blunt to the girl's face or passive aggressive, like, "Oh, that's a cute skirt." And if a guy heard it, they'd be like, "Oh no, that woman gave that woman a compliment." But if a girl heard it, we're like, "Oh, she hates that skirt." And it's like just a subtle like linguistic
Yeah.
difference of that if we're motivated by criticism and to avoid punishment, whereas you are more likely to be motivated by winning and not by criticism at all, then we're not communicating the same language. So we're withholding as a form of punishment, hoping you'll get what we're mad at you for and you'll learn, when in reality you're like, "Oh, we haven't done that in a while, I miss it." You're not thinking like, what could I have done that would cause her to withhold it? That's usually not that that's healthy if you did, but that's usually not the line of thinking most
Yeah.
withholding go through.
Yeah, so where I work with a lot of men is trying to even create the space for, like, how can you display to your significant other that you trust them to follow back up with you? Because a lot of times I think it's unfair for men when the conversation is, well, all he wants is sex. Well, how about if it's more of the only time we have conversation, there feels like there's such a pressure that I need to bring it up because organically it's not going to happen. So this is again that situation where you're balancing a bunch of kids. You're either doing homework or you're doing the dishes. You're making sure chores are done. You're making sure people are fed. You're going to make sure that they're washed. You're getting them in bed. Well, if I go from the gourmet experience of like just starting off without kids, and I had immediate accessibility to my spouse in many different ways, and then all of a sudden, maybe between 4 p.m. and 10 p.m., I'm going to at the most have 15 to 30 minutes of the two of us time. And it's going to be over 2 minute breaks of like, hey, 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 hey. Then how do I communicate that? And I think that there's another side of, there's a lot of men out there in relationships. They feel sort of like the puppy dog in the pet shop window of like, pick me, pick me, pick me, pick me. And I'm seeing the Dyson get picked. I'm seeing the dishes get picked. I'm seeing the kids be picked. I'm seeing, Wordle be picked. I'm seeing all. So at some point we bark. And I'm not saying that that's a permission slip for us to act like imbeciles.
Right.
The awareness needs to be understood that is my significant other getting pushed into a spot where he feels like if he doesn't demand it, if he doesn't say stuff in a bombastic way, then I'm not going to acknowledge that his needs exist.
Yeah, it's like the teenagers who act out because even bad attention is attention. Not that I'm calling men teenagers, but I'm drawing a parallel that the behavior becomes so in your face that you can't help but address it. It doesn't mean you comply, but you can't help but address it. That inadvertently, that's learning the lesson of like, well, the only time we were even able to talk about sex is when I asked in this way, and the brain goes, if I would like sex and I talking about it leads to doing it sometimes, let me do that again. When in reality, it's making again that bid in a language your partner can hear. It's not making it a demand because you've bid so many times. You're like, why aren't they getting it? Like you have to maybe even like we've talked about before, kind of ask like, hey, if I am wanting this experience with you, or I want to be experienced by you in this way, what is the best way for me to ask for that? And you're not doing it to be manipulative. You're doing it to show care and intent of like, clearly what I'm asking is not landing well. I don't want it to land the way it is. I want it to land this way. Can you assist me in filling in the gap? Like, instead of doing this behavior, what would you want more of instead? So you're actually giving the partner what they want. As much as women love if you would just figure it out without being told, most of us are also very willing to be like, if you just did this, that would work. And then if you do it, we're like, great, problem solved.
And now, time for an ad break. Hey there, listeners. We're interrupting your favorite podcast to bring you a special message from our friends over at Therapy Swag. Are you tired of the same old boring wardrobe? Ready to add a dash of sass and style into your closet while repping mental health? Look no further than Therapy Swag, your go-to online store for snarky shirts and mugs. Their products make awesome gifts for friends, family, or anyone in need of a little pick-me-up. They're on a mission to break the stigma surrounding mental health. They use humor and creativity to open up dialogue, challenge stereotypes, and remind us it's okay to not be okay. Because let's face it, laughter is the best medicine. So why settle for ordinary when you can stand out with therapy swag? Head over to their website today and treat yourself to some snarky goodness. Trust us, your wardrobe and your mood will thank you. Thanks to our sponsor for supporting the show. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Yeah, I mean, so this also brings up I want to recognize our position and the resentment that can be experienced, especially from, male significant others. That's where the entitlement side comes in. Because when I'll sit down, and especially with my men, when the sex topic comes out, I'm like, all right, let's write stuff down. I need to know what your expectations are.
Yeah.
And most of the time, I would say actually most of the time, the expectations are like spot on. Like, hey, I would love to be able to have physical intimacy with my wife 2 or 3 times a week, right? And then there's other times where there's a high level of pressure of I am owed this, right? Like if I don't get my cookie every 24 hours, then she's being a bitch. And there's this complete lack of empathy that exists for like whatever she's navigating, right? And I think that comes out of the fact that men, from a very young age, most men we're told quite quickly that we are a part of a token economy. Okay, what we do is then what we get back in acknowledgement, affirmation, value, and there might be a lot of you shaking your heads out there like, well, that's not how it's supposed to be. Well, there's a reason why when a girl falls over and she's young and her parents rush over and check up and see if she's okay, and then we tell a young boy just rub some dirt in it, right? Like you'll be fine, right?
Yeah.
There is a difference that happens. And so then what we start acknowledging is then we're owed things and that entitlement comes out. And you've all experienced this guy. This guy exists out there. He's universal, right? But the guy who constantly feels like everything is letting him down and he's accountable for nothing.
Yeah.
Right? That's why I wasn't even upset with your comment when you're like, well, I'm not trying to say men are like teenagers. Actually, that doesn't offend me because I do a lot of inner child work with my guys of like, guess what? If you're a wife and you're like, why is my husband acting like a 7-year-old right now? Or why is he throwing a tantrum over not being able to have sex tonight? It's because emotionally, he is an 8-year-old right now. He is responding as that inner child. Because that inner child is saying, I'm not seen, I'm not heard, I'm not appreciated, and the only way I'm going to get my cookie is if I go ahead and throw a fit. And that's why a lot of spouses will go, there's just such intensity that's coming out of you. And so I think this is where that awareness plays out. I'm not going to negotiate with a terrorist. I'm not expecting you to do that with your husband.
Right.
But I am saying, like, there is a little bit of ownership there. Like, if I'm working on him maintaining his side of the road, you also have to maintain yours, which is when he's making bids for connection, when he is meeting your needs, you then don't send him out into the desert for 40 days because you say, hey, I want you to feel uncomfortable. Like that then becomes malicious on your part. And I think a lot of times people don't want to have that discussion.
Yeah, and I think also there's a level of retribution sometimes that even though the bids are being bidded, I guess is that even a word? The bids are being offered now. The bids
Yeah.
maybe weren't being offered, or we as women were the ones offering the bids and they were not being acknowledged at all, like let alone turned away or against. They were like turned or turned against. They were just completely ignored, or the person wasn't even literally home to be there for the bid, or they'd missed the call, whatever it would be. That there's a level of a desire sometimes of wanting to make it even, not necessarily, but wanting to make the playing field even, like a redo or a starting both from zero, which for most of the time, no one's motivated. Like if your reward, I look at it this way, if your reward for getting out of debt would be getting $1 million, a lot more people want to get out of debt. If the only reward is to get to zero, it's not as motivating as most people think. That's why they're like, well, no one's motivated to just get to zero or to only avoid punishment. So if they're reward, this is not just men and women, if the person that you're in a partnership with, if their reward for matching the bids for connection is an abundance of what you both are wanting, they're more likely to match those bids. If the only reward is not being sent into the desert, they're probably going to lose steam to meet those bids, because that's not enough of a motivator for men this time specifically
Yeah.
to act in and do that. For us to avoid punishment as women is, or to avoid criticism, we would prefer to avoid criticism. So we'll do whatever behavior has us avoid being criticized, even if it just feels like we're just getting right to here. Phew, I'll be at 0 as long as I'm not criticized. So it's just a different mind state. That's like, why would holding still be occurring if the bids of connection are landing? And that would be probably the couple's work to do if you're working with a couple.
Yeah. I mean, that's a definite challenge. I guess, if anything, in this podcast, I don't know if this is resonating with you, but I want to encourage you of like, don't undercut your own possible growth areas. Like, you guys could actually, if all of a sudden your spouse is making the appropriate bids, he is meeting your needs, he is showing up in the capacity that you would have wanted him to show up in the entire time, don't use his past self against him. Don't sit in the spot of saying, oh, well, he's doing it now, but he didn't do it on my time. Because that's just as malicious as a person choosing not to recognize that your needs exist.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's the get lost sometimes as a couples therapist, is I'll sit down with people and it's like, it's almost like we're working against a treatment plan. Well, how come he gets to not be the asshole now? Well, because he's not being the asshole now. He gets to be your husband. He's not your adversary. He's your ally. Like, and it's not a position of trying to say that forgiveness is forgetting. I want you to step out. If he ends up doing things that are incorrect again, that has to be called out. But if that's not what he's doing, and he is meeting your needs, and he is making you feel safe, there is actually no virtue in you artificially bringing in chaos.
I think sometimes couples get pattern or certain roles needing to be in place, like a kitchen running with a chef and a sous chef. The nights that it finds it can just run with the sous chef or just run with the chef, every other staff member's like, what is going on here? Like, we're not used to this. It doesn't mean after a week or 2 weeks they're like, oh, we actually don't need the sous chef whatever night it is, we've got this. But it's a rough adjustment beginning, because it's not how the system is typically used to function. It will eventually be the new norm, but that in between of old norm and new norm is a really uncomfortable growth point for a lot of couples in many topics, especially when it comes to behavior change, where the one member is typecast as most common overfunctioner, underfunctioner, weaponized incompetence, mother-child or father-child relationships. Like, if there's roles where there's a difference in the hierarchy and it's more of a vertical relationship where there's not equitability or mutuality versus the horizontal eye to eye, I see you, so many couples avoid seeing the partner as an equal and not bringing up their past self, because it would mean true closeness, which is what a lot of us are actually really afraid of. So it's not that I want to be mean or I want to be punitive or want to send you in the desert for 40 days. What it means is I'd have to unknow who I'm used to being, and the self that I developed to protect myself against the asshole version of you is going to feel betrayed. And she's had my back more than you have, because this new behavior that will eventually be norm, hopefully, is new. I don't trust it yet. And when I don't trust, here's what I do, right? Having that level of vulnerability is required, honestly, in couples counseling. It's uncomfortable, but it's required.
Exactly. I mean, there should be parts where there's a slight discomfort because we're trying new things out. I'm not asking you to do anything where you position yourself in an unsafe way, but that's dream jump to. Is that like, oh, well, because this isn't ironclad, I can't try to do these things. And you might be sitting there confused. Adam, what are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about like what happens when your husband does put the kids down, your husband does do the dishes, your husband does whatever you need in that moment, and then he says, hey, would you like to go sit on the porch and have some wine? And you go do your own thing, right? Or he says, hey, would you like to watch that show that you like to watch? And you're like, no, I've got laundry to do, or I've got this to do, or I've got the Or I've also had it where I've had gentlemen explain to me like, well, I can't actually let her let me help. Like, and that's that chef sous chef situation, right? If I've built the kitchen myself, then I don't want to trust someone else to do it because they're not going to do it the same way I'm going to do it. And the
That's, yeah.
is the same exact way the thing that brings success, or is there it still gets done and completed?
Yes, and that's where couples, I teach this to parents too with kids, because they are often not on the same page with each other, which means they're definitely not going to be on the same page with the child or teenager. That the key is asking, what is the most important in this event or in this instance? Is it, and this change, is it how it gets done? Is it that it gets done? Is
Mm,
it when it gets done, or who it gets done by? And that's the litmus test, like the checklist I give to every single person. You can ask yourself this too, of like, where is my panic coming from? Where is my resistance coming from? Oh, it's because for me, the most important thing, my goal is how. Your
mm,
goal is when. We're already not, the that it gets done is the same part of the sentence, but those two words being different, we're going to have conflict, because men will often be like, well, it's done, what's the point? It's like, but you, right, the bath time, but you didn't do it the way it needs to be done.
mm,
I would do it. And maybe the child is used to having, I don't know, songs first, then toys, then this. And yeah, you like, if your goal is like, oh, they're clean, you missed the point. That's not the point of bath time. The point is the bond and the this. And that's where couples, again, not having the behind the scenes of what makes it important. What about the checklist is important that dreams within conflict? Like, what is the hope you have or the disaster you have if this does or doesn't happen? That's where couples can actually start to get along and go, oh, so my thing was just that bath time was getting done, but yours is how it gets done. And because I care about you and want to be close to you, and notice if I do it how you like, that I'm actually closer to you, I'll do it that way. It doesn't mean I intrinsically want to. It means I care about you and I care about our connection, which is my goal. My ultimate goal is get bath time done so we can be closer. But I also know how, so that you're also in the mood to connect with me after. Like, that's where compromise comes in, not compromise of the self, compromise between partners of achieving whatever the task is.
well said. Yeah, I think so often we fall into this position of like winners, losers, who's right, who's wrong, that we forget that there's like this whole other capacity for us to work together as partners and then have a truly like rooted experience in unconditional positive regard where we can feel seen, we feel heard, but we also can feel like the closure of having completed something. Where if you're constantly doing something without your other half, it doesn't really feel like you're making very many victories. It feels like you're doing a lot of things alone. And so, being able to open yourself up to allow yourself to be served also intrinsically leads to you wanting to be closer to that other person. But if I'm finding strategic ways to sort of hold out to make it so that no one can meet my needs but myself, what you're communicating to the world and to yourself is that you are only interested in a relationship with yourself.
Yes. And that ties into our previous episode, that the self sabotage, like, there is a requirement that I encourage couples to uphold, that you ought to, whatever you benefit from, I think is how I usually reframe that. Maintaining a relationship with yourself that also allows space for another person in your
Mhm.
life. Not either or, it's both. And I have a relationship with myself, and I can also have a
Yeah.
relationship with another person. And a lot of people aren't taught that because of, look at our societal structure and cultural hierarchy from previous generations. There was no need for an emotional relationship. We were with you because we were financially dependent, and the only way for me to be a stay-at-home mom was for you to go to work. Very stereotypic example here, and that's the way the world functioned. And now doesn't have to function that way. There's other ways it could, and so many people are wanting to be connected to their partner, but we're in new uncharted territory where we have almost not necessarily demands for connection, but in a way it is. We have so many demands we have at our disposal to request of our partner. It's uncharted territory. There was never a need for somebody to be a financial provider and an emotional provider and a spiritual provider. That wasn't needed in previous generations. And now it is not only, I think, for many needed, it's desired. I want that. I want a partner who can provide, but
Mm.
also provide relationally. And for men, usually it's this way. They weren't taught how to do that. It's not sometimes that you don't want to. For some men, it is. They don't have a desire. For some, they have a great desire, but they don't know how to meet that demand. Like they don't have the supply to meet the demand in their relationship.
Just because we're good at rationing ourselves from love and from emotional connection doesn't mean that that should be a strategy we use for ourselves. I think that that's when you can really watch relationships be put under immense strain, is when we both get into that rationing of like, and I know we've been a little stereotypical with talking about like the love languages. Oh, guys want sex, whatnot. But there is this thing with all the love languages that we do as partners recognize what our significant others' love languages are, and then at times we do ration them. We do almost put embargoes on like, I'm not going to share that with you. I'm not going to do that because I know she's going to get a benefit out of it. Even if I know it's also mutually beneficial. Like when it's like, well, why didn't you take out the diaper genie? Or why didn't you do this? Or did you know that there was a dirty diaper here? Did you like, and it's interesting because at times people will stand back and be like, well, I knew that's what they wanted me to do. And it's like, well, let's also take into consideration that there can be a child involved that's all of a sudden collateral damage. How about the fact that like our home, the sanctuary that we're in, can become collateral damage? So I'm not willing to take care of or prune or do all these things that I need to around the house because I'm trying to make a point. And that point is really me choking myself out at the same time. Like, I don't think that you're ever going to be able to put your spouse down in a way where you don't also take yourself down with them.
Collateral damage, yeah.
Yeah, you are attached to them at the hip. So if I am trying to tear them down, recognize you're pulling the bricks off of your pile to throw it at them.
Yeah, that's a good visual. I think that's a powerful visual for couples to keep in mind. And asking, you've asked this question before, interpersonally, relationally, like how do I want to be experienced? I for as many couples and individuals as I've worked with and work with, my question to them is always like, what's your end goal? Like, what was the purpose of that behavior? What is your goal? Well, I want them to whatever. Okay, well, we can't force people to do things. And then that's when I asked the question you taught me, like, how did you want to be experienced? So I wanted to be taken seriously. I wanted to be validated emotionally. So what part of your behavior did that? And sometimes it does match and it's the partner's work to be done. And sometimes, oh yeah, I could have worded that differently. Great. Now you have agency and ownership. You can try it again. And then the cycle can change where it switches from a demand to a bid, or a demand to a request, where you're more clear rather than sometimes people are like passive of like, it would be so nice. That's not a request. That's just stating that something would be nice. That's my biggest pet peeve. It'd be so nice if somebody would do the dishes, and the person's like, yeah, it would, because it's true. It would be nice if there was a dish fairy that would just come in and do it. It's not real. That's such a different request than, hi, I need the dishes to be done so it's off of my plate so we can actually have sex tonight. That is a totally different direction than like, it would be nice if, or we like look at our partner and look at the dishes and then walk in the living room. That's also not a request or a bid.
No.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think we've dropped enough on them for this week to start thinking about, well, how have I been using this maybe silently and not recognizing that I actually set my partner up for failure, or even my own expectations for failure, because I don't actually express what my need is or allow that need to be met.
Yeah. Noodle on that one, listeners, and email us or DM us if you have had your mind blown by today's episode. And please rate the show and share the episodes if you like it.
All right. Well, then we'll see you guys soon.
All right. Thank you, listener.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Between Two Clinicians. We would so appreciate if this episode resonated with you, for you to share it with somebody, and also find your favorite podcast platform and like, rate, and subscribe to the podcast. We would love to attract more listeners just like you and have this message be spread to whoever needs it. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.